Hey there everyone, this is ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Well, you asked questions, I got answers. Let's run through them, and I'll be including time codes in the video description if you want to jump back to or skip to something quickly. And as always, I do apologize if you did ask something, but I didn't happen to see it. With all that said, let's get to it. Bay asks, do you ever get burnt out? Absolutely. Earlier this year, I actually had a pretty serious case of burnout on two fronts. One that's a little bit more relevant to this channel was the anime burnout around February and March, where I was barely watching anything aside from stuff I was group watching with people. It didn't matter if it was an older show that I had been interested in for a while or something currently airing that had my attention. My drive to watch or read was simply not there at all. Burnout fades away at some point, but I couldn't see any particular endpoint, and I do have to admit that some of the armchair psychoanalysis to explain what my problem was turned out to be far more unhelpful than anything else. If I knew what was causing my burnout, I would just fix it, and that would be that. What ultimately broke me out of it was watching Attack Number 1. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? I watch a show and it turns out I don't want to continue it? But, lo and behold, that first episode, and the first 10-ish minutes especially, seemed to just completely knock me out of my funk, and I watched the whole 104-episode show in about 1 month. Sometimes all it takes is a little jolt of inspiration to shake you awake. And then there was the real-life burnout that I was experiencing. I generally don't like to get too vocal on YouTube about my personal life, since I do like to maintain a separation between my online self and the real world. But to summarize it, my apartment living situation had become almost unbearable. Everything, from the grounds themselves being uncared for, to the tenants blasting loud music at completely unreasonable hours, to the management's sheer inaction, made it all the more apparent that I had to get out of there as quickly as possible. It impacted my ability to sleep, to work on my dissertation, and to make videos since it was just about impossible to concentrate. And considering how much I was paying for rent in a place that had gone to hell in a handbasket so quickly, I was left with no other reasonable option. I've since moved out and am in a better environment now, so I am okay. But to go back to the original question, yes, I do get burnt out sometimes. Are we gonna continue the Panda Kopanda in group watch someday? Don't worry, we will. Plus, we'll probably watch both installments since it's been over a year since we watched the first one. Plus, pandas are cool, so who would want to turn down seeing more pandas? Do you like yogurt? I've tried numerous flavors, brands, and types. Aside from frozen yogurt, I just cannot say that I like any of it. My mother, though, is a massive fan of yogurt, to the point where she has had Dannon's coffee yogurt every single day for breakfast since before I was born. This is a habit that only just broke at the start of 2025. McSuper asks, do you enjoy the weekly viewing experience more, such as for seasonal anime, or do you enjoy binge watching more? If I had been asked this question a few years ago, I would have said binge watching. I used to lament having to wait for a new episode of something when watching seasonals because, well, I thought that if an episode was truly that great, I'd want to see more immediately. Binge watching was also what got me back into anime during the periods when I was pausing. I binged the entirety of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure so I could get to the currently airing Diamond is Unbreakable. I binged The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, Hunter x Hunter, and several others. So binge watching is rather integral to how I became an anime fan now. But over time, I am not completely sure that binge watching and I get along too well. I've often found that shows that I have the least ability to remember details from tend to be the binge-watched ones. I think part of the reason why is that when binge-watching something, you don't get the chance to let an episode or a moment truly sink in. Waiting and processing something is just as integral to your experience as seeing all of the episodes, and the only clock that is actually imposed is the one we impose on ourselves. So especially when I'm watching something older, I try to limit myself to a few episodes rather than trying to marathon it or knock out half of it in a single day if it's a 12 to 13 episode series. As such, I also like the seasonal experience of waiting when watching one episode per week. Patience is a virtue, and this also counts when it comes to media consumption. Of course, I do binge watch things on occasion, but it's not nearly as common as it used to be beforehand. Das asks, what's a question that you like asking yourself? Or what's a question that you like to ask yourself? About once every 2 to 3 weeks, I like to ask myself, how am I doing? Though that's a pretty simple question in and of itself, it's a part of the larger and important task of constantly checking in on myself and seeing what has been going well, what isn't going well, what can be improved, and what can be cut out of my life in order to make myself happier and healthier. Sometimes there's nothing that needs to be addressed, and sometimes I spend a long time looking at myself and reflecting on my own behavior and decisions, at times being highly critical. This is a regular thing that I started doing back about a decade ago, and was instrumental in helping me to break out of some of my bad habits and far more unpleasant self compared to who I am now. One thing that I say to some of my online friends is that they would not have gotten along with the old version of me. When I have the privilege of teaching university students in person especially, I implore them to do something similar so that their mental health does not run away at times when they might need it most. One of the worst things that can happen to us is losing our own sense of stability, and being sure to check in on yourself can stop a lot of problems from snowballing later. You can't always stop your problems from existing, but recognizing them early and trying to head them off at the pass, even in seemingly incidental ways, can save you so much time and health later. Sayonara asks, what do you look for in essays from a student as a teacher, and from animanga as an essayist/reviewer standpoint? And how similar are those traits between forums when writing a good essay? That's a good question. When it comes to my own university students, I am not looking for a giant fountain of insight that revolutionizes anything. More so than anything, I am looking to see if they have earnestly taken the time to explore their aesthetic feelings and try to understand why something does or does not work, and be able to articulate why in a way that is understandable to someone who is not them. It doesn't need to be the most technical explanation, and it's all right if not all the pieces are aligned. My course is designed so that even students who have never taken a music class a day in their lives, and that number is way higher than one would want to assume, can still succeed with flying colors. Learning about the arts is an eternal process, and especially depending on when we get exposed to the idea of exploring our own aesthetic perspectives or lives, some of us are earlier or later bloomers than others. In the case of my own class, especially since I have the benefit of tracking students writing consistently over a dozen weeks, I can see receptivity unfold in real time, and that makes subsequently helping them with their thoughts a lot easier by giving them an angle to explore based on what they've written before. When it comes to the perspective as a reviewer or anime essayist, I find that my standards are a little harsher concerning what I read or experience. The general feeling of exploring aesthetic feeling and conveying that has not changed, but since posting a review online is something that you're doing voluntarily rather than as a forced activity for school, there's a different kind of pressure to articulate yourself in a manner that reads as mature or insightful. And though it's true that everybody must start somewhere, I tend to find a lot of review analysis lacking and unable to move beyond words like peak, mid, trash, or other buzzwords or simple phrases that don't really say anything, if not just outright walking through the media or characters plot point by plot point. Truth be told, there are very few print reviews that I've read where I feel like the writer was onto something. And if I had to offer a preliminary diagnosis as to why that's the case, it's because they tend to get stuck in a very systematized look at media. For instance, if a review has giant paragraphs labeled story, characters, plot, enjoyability, and assigns each of those a number that somehow factors into a math equation to calculate what score to give something, I am immediately turned off and will almost inevitably stop reading partway through. Even just by looking at the physical outline of the print on the page, that can itself be a sign of what you're dealing with. All the properties of media are not separate. They inform and influence one another. That's not to say that the writing itself is somehow dishonest, but that the manner of presentation for the writing itself is translatable to a first impression, and as the old saying goes, first impressions mean everything. There's also the fact that there's plenty of stuff written purely because the actual motive has nothing to do with the media in question, but instead is about getting attention or a following, among other things. I'm not just talking about rage bait or trolling here. I've often joked with friends that the quickest way to get attention on AniList is to write positive reviews of Steins Gate or Your Lie in April, because since those are old properties that tend to be so beloved, you could have some of the worst writing ever, but most people won't care since the score at the bottom is what they're actually concerned with before any reasoning you may proffer. And though I can understand the argument, what about reviewing things for fun? To me, that's the real kicker. Writing a good review, positive or negative or middling, is itself a lot of fun. Trying to put together the pieces of your responses and reactions into something tangible that can be read by other people is a delight. I do believe there is something to the idea of the reader being able to pick up when the reviewer is having genuine fun engaging with the work rather than simply walking through it or simping over a character. Medley Notes asks, if time or money weren't an issue, where in the world would you like to go? I wouldn't want to go to just one place, I can tell you that. I'd want to spend at least a few days in every country that I could possibly muster. I'd want to experience both some of the touristy things, yes, but I'd like to spend most of my time seeing what lies beyond that, finding that interesting little restaurant that serves incredible food but doesn't get in any brochures, free roaming without a specific agenda and just basking in the sight, smell, and sound of each place. You get the idea. Maybe catch a local event or two. To put it another way, I'd like to experience a place in full and have the feeling that, as brief as my time there was, it was fulfilling in every sense. Do I have some places I'd rather go to sooner than others? Well, certainly. I'd love to revisit Austria without being tied to a program abroad, as well as Italy during a time when it isn't over 105 degrees Fahrenheit, or 40.5 degrees Celsius for our international friends. I'd likewise like to visit Japan. My brother and sister-in-law have gone there several times and adored it, and Armenia, specifically the places where my ancestors lived before the genocide. Opinions on aleatoric music? Well, it's not typically what I reach for, but I certainly don't dislike it or anything of that sort. I suppose I find it conceptually more interesting than as something to actually listen to. But I'd also be lying if I said that Iannis Xenakis' Pithoprakta was not really cool, or quite a number of things from Earle Brown, like December 1952. Do you feel like watching the Precure franchise? Definitely, yes. The Precure franchise was always something that I was aware of, and despite really liking quite a few Mahou Shoujo, that's one franchise that for whatever reason I just have not committed to watching yet. I'm particularly interested in the Heartcatch Precure installment since it's the one that I've been the most recommended, but no watch time just yet. Is this also the point where I say that I also haven't watched any Ojamajo Do-Re-Mi? Okay, that's not entirely true. I did watch the 25th anniversary video of the Ojamajo Carnival song I'd say about 20 times is a pretty fair estimate. Maybe I should put this to a vote. Precure or Ojamajo Do-Re-Mi? Which do I see first? Murai-san asks, what do you think about art in the modern era? Is it confined only to entertainment, or does it hold the value to affect society in deeper ways? Let's break this down a little bit. Art in the modern era is kind of in an interesting space. With how widely accessible and proliferated art in any of its forms can be, from the classic novel to streamed television to furry fan art with pronounced oppai, the idea of art's social impact, whether that art is fictitious or non-fictitious, seems to have lessened. Anyone wanting to consume art in the 21st century has to contend with a non-stop torrent of art coming from nearly all directions, and it's impossible to be aware of everything and everywhere all at once. There's more inherent competition for a person's attention now than there was even 30 years ago. The outpouring of social media, 24-hour news, and articles or sound bites that can be written in mere moments to capitalize on an angst, other feeling, or event tend to be the things that move and impact society as a whole. That may not necessarily be true for the individual, but it seems like if larger-scale social actions are going to be taken, it would likely not be in response to a piece of art. Art runs the risk of lagging behind the immediacy of the moment, which means that its ability to remain timely is constantly in jeopardy. Taking some pages out of American history for a moment, two pieces of literature that were monolithic in their influence over American thinking were Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was written to advocate for the notion of governmental egalitarianism and independence, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was radical in shaping the perception and morality of American slavery as something truly evil. Both books are still worth reading, by the way. Now, admittedly, both are political books, but they were written during a period when such topics were highly relevant, and they did not have to contend with nearly so many other artistic distractions. In order for art to have a place as a social force that invokes change, it needs to be given the time to ascend its pulpit and speak its wisdom. And even then, there's no guarantee its wisdom will be well spoken. But in a world that is constantly moving and changing seemingly every minute, an art piece runs the risk of becoming irrelevant quickly, or becomes perceived as a thing to cash in on a sentiment, like with the live-action remakes of classic Disney films, rather than do or stand for anything substantial. So, art is at the mercy of an ever-changing world that it has to reside in, a more pronounced economic cynicism concerning its purpose, because artists do need to make money in order to live, and I really don't think that anybody is going to insist that artists must suffer, and an overstimulation and oversaturation of the market. And that's not even getting into all the factors here. There are tens and thousands of art pieces created every single day, but how many of them actually find their way to us, or to a larger social consciousness outside whatever niche sphere they're more likely to be seen in? If we consider art to be this completely abstract concept pulled from the aether and made concrete so that it may be shared, that's not really art's fault, it's the world that it finds itself in. So, needless to say, I'm skeptical of art's ability to actually change the world, or to be more precise, to change the world as the world exists now. Again, that may be true for the individual, but I'm also rather skeptical of when people say that an art piece changed them or taught them something. I'm not saying that it can't, but well, if you're still acting like an asshole to other people no matter how much Tomino Yoshiyuki anime you've watched, or if you needed an anime to tell you how to love, I have some eyebrows to raise and questions to ask. And as for the second part of the question you asked about art being confined to entertainment, entertainment is probably the most likely chance that any art has to retain enduring appeal or value. But as a note, art is absolutely everywhere. The architecture of a building, the layout of the local park, not just the paths that people walk, but how the flowers are planted, how a room is decorated, the quiet earnestness of stargazing. Art can be more than a thing to consume if you look at it a certain way. To temporarily change a phrase from Friedrich Nietzsche for a moment, without art, life would be a mistake. The original quote said music instead of art, but you get the idea. Art's capacity to exist moves leaps and bounds beyond entertainment, and as long as we are willing to allow ourselves to experience the totality of it all, the world can be seen and experienced in deeper, more empathic colors, sounds, and feelings. Sir Eminon asks, you mentioned in a previous Q&A that you don't follow any particular bands or artists, but do you have a go-to classical composer whose music you find yourself going back to? And if so, which pieces are your favorite? Alternatively, if you don't have a favorite composer in mind and simply seek out individual pieces, what would those be? One of the things about studying music and teaching it to university students is that you kind of need to know a little bit of everything for classical music. But even so, there are a few composers who I tend to listen to more casually than others. Franz Schubert's massive collection of Lieder, particularly Die Schöne Müllerin and Winterreise, Maurice Ravel and Claude Debussy's piano music, especially Jeu d'eau and L'Île Joyeuse respectively, and Johann Sebastian Bach for, well, pretty much anything that he ever wrote, regardless of what it is. His organ music, his cantatas, the Goldberg variations, truly whatever. I actually used his Ich ruf zu dir, Herr Jesu Christ, in the video I made about the 2 Hiroshima specials as background music. And as for some others just to throw out there, Steve Reich, Johannes Ockeghem, Kaija Saariaho, Louis Vierne, Joan Tower, Thomas Morley, Peter Tchaikovsky, and Charles Ives. I'll include some recordings for all of these in the video's description. Surprised that this hasn't been brought up in other videos, unless I just completely missed it, but what are your favorite foods? Nah, you didn't miss it. If I had to choose a favorite food or favorite meal, it's tough to beat a good veal parmesan, or quite frankly, any Italian meal. And for something simpler, fewer things make me smile more than a good choreg, especially in the morning. Both of those answers may be my ancestral bias talking, but...
I regret nothing.
Bastbard asks, a thoughtful one. Is there any manga, anime, or Japanese game that tackles faith, theism, or spirituality in a powerful or interesting way to you? And if so, how? Well, my initial response would be Yoshitoshi Abe's Haibane Renmei or Oshimamoru's Angel's Egg, but if you want a response that is neither of those, I was quite taken by The Colors Within and how it positioned religion as an orienting force. It brought the two main characters together while also showing how they were both able to repurpose ideas of faith as a force both for artistic inspiration and for analyzing the split between lies, truth, and realizing that something can be true, but not for you specifically. While some media would take larger grandstanding about weighing particularly egregious sins against one another in an effort to show some kind of false moral equivalency, The Colors Within argues that, even within the more mundane settings or people, not all quote-unquote sins are created equal. And not only is that perfectly fine, but it is through this realization that something beautiful can be found, nourished, and explored through the act of committing light sinning. I also need to take a quick minute to highlight Night on the Galactic Railroad, and how it positions the afterlife as an inevitable destination, but one whose journey is given significance by the ways in which we view what matters in life, including the lives we've lived spiritually in both the secular and sacred senses. Those significances, especially of self-sacrifice and service, survive through our relationships and inspire us to become better people, the beauty of the surreal creating beauty in the real. And while I won't get too into it, I also need to shout out Tokyo Babylon because, while it's not quite theist or faith-driven in the sense we normally associate with the term, it does tackle the inherent spirituality of its main characters and setting in a rather fascinating manner. A classic one. What historical figure, ideally from the art world, would you want to necromantically interview? Well, my joking answer would be Franz Kafka, because it sounds like a plot in a Kafka story. Revived after dying, only to die again as soon as the purpose is over. My serious answer would be Stephen Sondheim. While I study his work as part of my living, and he had been no stranger to giving interviews, there are entire portions of his work and life that have not been explored nearly as much, and I would give anything to pick his brain about the pieces he wrote under Oscar Hammerstein II's tutelage. They've never been published or performed anywhere for a variety of reasons, and I'd love to hear what went into the process of creating those. A stupid one. Congratulations! Through sheer miracle, an old-school 3-episode OVA adapting a Final Fantasy game will be produced. Which one would you like to see get that specific treatment? Well, I can't really pick Final Fantasy V because Rintaro already made a sequel OVA series to that game, but let's assume that you mean involving the original cast, so I guess I can still consider that one. I suppose there's two ways to approach this. Do I want an animated recreation of the game in some form, or something closer to a side story? So why don't we approach this from both angles? As a recreation of the original game, I'd love to see a 3-episode OVA of Final Fantasy VI, each one touching upon a particularly significant moment of the early plot. I'd want the 3 episodes to touch upon the initial march to Narsh, then either the battle at Castle Figaro or Doma, and the Opera House sequence. And if for whatever reason I was forced to pick a portion of the late game, it would be the floating island and the Cataclysm, or immediately afterwards with Celeste. For something closer to a side story, I'd kill to see something involving the cast of Final Fantasy IX. I'm thinking some stories that would take place after the main game, such as, for instance, an episode involving Tantalus trying to put on a play production where things are going awry during the rehearsal period, an episode about rebuilding Burmecia after the game's finished to give Freya and Fratley something more substantial, and Zidane trying to settle into being Princess Garnet's boyfriend post-game, and the two of them trying to sneak off away from Steiner for some privacy. Comedic hijinks, and also some serious stuff. Animuswator asks, another music-related question like last time. What would be the best advice you could give to someone who wants to learn another new instrument additionally to one they're playing already, but doesn't know how to start or get going? Example, I play snare drum right now, but I'd really like to learn bass guitar or something similar to that. The best piece of advice that I could give someone who wants to learn a new instrument is that you need to ask yourself a basic question. Why do you want to learn this new instrument? How you answer that question is going to help dictate what happens moving forward. If it's because you think it'd be fun, that's fine, but my experience has taught me that the initial enthusiasm tends to dissolve rather quickly once you've run up against your first practicing roadblocks. It helps to have a more tangible goal, something that you can look to as a strong point of orientation. You don't need to shoot for the stars, just have something that you can aim for and track your progress. Practicing is more a mental exercise than a physical one, hence why you can spend an hour in a practice room and to make minimal steps forward. Toblerone asks, acknowledging the current state of the anime industry and the issues facing it today, on which you've made at least one video about already, is there one thing that you're optimistic about when it comes to the industry? Not particularly, no. The only real things I can say I'm optimistic about is the increased visibility of the industry's problems, like with the controversy surrounding MAPPA and workers being more public concerning their maltreatment by higher-ups. That's a good thing. Not the mistreatment, the fact that it's more visible. I find that any optimism I have about anime is generally more regarded into specific people and what they're working on, as opposed to anything related to anime, the corporate enterprise. Tomi Palese asks, what is the state of anime criticism on YouTube today, in your opinion? Well, I'm certainly no shades of AniTube Digest, but one thing that made me want to start doing AniTube in the first place was a general discontent with some of the platform's biggest figures. In that sense, my sense of the state of AniTube is that it is, to use a word, incurious. I suppose that I find it kind of dismaying that, for some channels that have the monumental following that they do, they don't use that following to somehow increase the anime community's collective IQ about anime or manga. I don't mean in terms of what is a property to keep your eye on that will be airing soon, but rather how the hell this industry works, who are the people in it, etc. Part of the reason why the Finding Kyoto Animation project was a thing that I wanted to do was not just to re-experience the studio's canon, but also to take the time to walk through the studio's history and its numerous creative personnel and try to find some of the lineages that lay within. It was a blast watching a lot of the studio's outsourcing work for the Nurse Witch Komugi video, and there's several others from that time that I want to see but haven't started yet. Instead, when I look at AniTube collectively, I see a lot of meme-generating, quick overviews of the season that involve making a quip about each show, and then of course cutting out the jokes for the one or two things that the creator actually cares about, or talking about a thing that has been talked about to death already and offering nothing particularly insightful. Do we really need a 5,000th video about the characters or themes in One Piece, or Dragon Ball, or anything else that's already absurdly popular? Either that, or the types of people that make content every single day in response to whatever the hot take of that day happens to be, and in the process, not taking the time to process their own feelings or stances. Remember that whole thing I said during McSuper's question about binge watching not being the best way to retain or reflect on what you're seeing? Binge content creation is also a problem that feeds that. At the time I'm writing this, the hot button issue of the day is Rent a Girlfriend chapter 380. I'm not saying this is the whole of what is there, but several channels I used to follow, bigger and smaller, I no longer do, because I think for my own innate sense of curiosity, AniTube just doesn't offer what I want, or the channels themselves are no longer really curious about otaku media. I don't find myself moved by content that's about how this anime made me cry, or fabricating a reason for why this manga is actually far darker than you remember, or why this anime is really good and everyone else is a moron for disagreeing, or I see the truth and they don't, aren't I cooler and smarter than them? How much of this content contributes to anything, including not looking like an absolute twat? I don't mean to knock anybody listening if your favorite creators do some of the things that I'm mentioning, but let's just say that, for me at least, if I want to actually learn about anime or manga, AniTube is really not the place that I would look to find that information. Or, at the very least, not at first. Peter Trin asks, favorite Chopin piece, and favorite Chopin nocturne if your favorite Chopin piece is not a nocturne. Mazurka Opus 7, number 1 in B-flat major. And as far as my favorite Chopin nocturne, joke's on you, Maria Szymanowska, Nocturne in B-flat major, Polish pianist and performer before Chopin. And that's all she wrote, folks. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions, and thanks again to everyone for watching, commenting, subscribing, and following along with me on what is now a 4-year journey. I honestly don't think I could ever properly express just how grateful I am to have any audience at all. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Here's hoping that things can continue into another great year. In the meantime, this has been ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Happy viewing, everyone.